Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, New Democrats believe in open and progressive trade. We believe in negotiating new market access for our exporters to unlock good jobs here in Canada. We believe in promoting value-added industries to raise standards of living and create benefits for all Canadians and across all sectors. Canada is a wealthy country and a trading nation. We have maintained strong trade balances for decades, yet this story has changed under this Conservative government. On February 11th, I asked the Minister of Trade to explain to Canadians why his trade policies were failing to reverse Canada's troubling numbers on trade. I was referring to news that Canada's trade deficit had widened to $1.7 billion in December 2013, worse than that forecasted by economic experts, and that Canada's monthly merchandise trade deficit was now more than 2 years old. That deficit was big enough in that fiscal quarter, Mr. Speaker, to knock a full percentage point off of Canada's GDP. Since then, Statistics Canada has announced that Canada's current account deficit has increased to $16 billion in the fourth quarter of 2013, and our current account deficit for 2013 totals now $61 billion. Our current account has been in deficit now for 5 straight consecutive years. Now, when the Conservatives came to power in 2006, they inherited a current account surplus of some $26 billion. Today, we have a current account deficit of some $61 billion. That's an $85 billion swing in 7 years. That's $12 billion loss in our current account performance for each and every year the Conservatives have been in power. Worse, our trade woes are entirely sectoral. In a written statement about Canada's trade deficit made last November, BMO Chief Economist Doug Porter said, and I quote, "There is energy doing just fine, and there is everything else doing anything but fine." End quote. In 2013, Canadian energy exports saw a $63 billion surplus, while everything else in Canada's economic basket saw a $73 billion deficit. Now, Mr. Speaker, Canadians are rightly proud of our energy sector, but a modern, well-diversified economy needs to be firing on all of its cylinders, not just one. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives want Canadians to trust them when they tell us they understand the economy. If they do understand economics, Conservatives should admit that these statistics are bad news for a sustainable and prosperous Canadian economy. As Conservatives should know, a country that runs a sustained current account deficit is building liabilities with the rest of the world, and eventually those liabilities need to be paid back. According to senior IMF officials, quote, "Whether a country should run a current account deficit depends on the extent of its foreign liabilities or external debt, and whether the borrowing will finance investment with a higher marginal product than the interest rate the country has to pay on its foreign liabilities." End quote. Let's think about this for a minute. Canada's foreign debt has never been higher than it is now under this Canadian Conservative government. As evidenced by our export performance that I mentioned earlier, the Conservative legacy for Canada amounts to putting all of Canada's economic eggs in a narrow basket. Canada's productivity has slumped by almost 2% since the Conservatives came to power in 2006. It is also the case that while fluctuations in a current account are tolerable, a chronic, sustained current account deficit hurts our economy. According to IMF analysis, these are not the conditions under which a government can justify long-term current account deficits. So it makes you wonder what happens if commodity prices or production drops in Canada's energy sector. With massive Conservative-induced government debt, productivity weakness, and no significant export growth in other sectors, Canada's current account deficit problem is a problem this government simply cannot continue to ignore. That is why our Bank of Canada has singled out Canada's poor export performance as a major cause of Canada's slow growth and lack of well-paying full-time jobs in Canada. Mr. Speaker, any investment planner in Canada would advise Canadians to do 3 things: diversify, 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 and deal with chronic deficit. So, how can the Conservatives continue to justify their massive current account deficits year after year after year?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for repeating diversification 3 times in his question, because I think that strategy shows the underpinnings of our government's approach to trade and our approach to make sure that we close the current account deficit with respect to trade, but to also show you that we're in the midst of a diversification effort that really is unparalleled, Mr. Speaker. And sadly, there is no diversity or no diversification in the NDP's long and multi-generational opposition to trade. He mentioned the energy sector and mentioned that everything else is having difficulties. Well, really, Mr. Speaker, the global recession in 2008 shows why nations have been struggling, particularly in the manufacturing sector. Canadians really, for several generations, relied on our U.S. markets to the south that had a voracious appetite for pretty much everything we produced, our goods and services. For example, in 2008, our exports to the United States were $368 billion. Recession, global recession hits, Mr. Speaker. The next year, in 2009, those exports to the United States dropped to $270 billion as a result of the crisis. Now, by 2012 statistics, it shows that that important and critical relationship for Canada is regrowing, but those export levels remain at around 10% below the pre-recession levels. Mr. Speaker, it's important to note the consistency on the NDP's side with respect to U.S. free trade agreement and ultimately NAFTA is that party opposed both of those agreements, Mr. Speaker. 1 in 5 jobs in Canada are attributable to trade, and 40,000 Canadian enterprises, small, medium, and large, are exporters, Mr. Speaker. And our global commerce strategy, which was reinvigorated and strategically focused in November of last year into the Global Markets Action Plan, is addressing the need for new markets. And I'll show you why, Mr. Speaker, because my friend used some statistics. The period between 2009 and 2013, as a result of our diversification efforts, U.S. growth, export growth is recovering. Traditional markets like the United Kingdom is up 16%, Mexico, our NAFTA partner, 13%. But importantly, new and emerging markets around the world, Mr. Speaker, China up 84%, Hong Kong up 229%. So our Global Markets Action Plan, this government takes a strategic approach to grow new markets for Canadian employers to sell our best goods and services in new and growing markets. And there are markets where we have had drops, Mr. Speaker. Germany is down 7%. South Korea, a drop of 3%, mainly because the U.S. and other countries have free trade agreements with South Korea, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to say the European trade deal agreement in principle will address some of our gaps in Europe, and our negotiations with South Korea, which I urge my honourable colleague to support, will address our drop in South Korea because of our competitive disadvantage to our competitors. As we've signed free trade agreements, Mr. Speaker, trade with those countries has grown exponentially because of our work diversifying. Colombia, exports have grown by 22%, Peru, 42%, Switzerland, 48%, Mr. Speaker. So clearly, our government, not only through the Global Markets Action Plan, has shown that we're going to target key areas and key industries where we can sell our world-class goods and services, not just with our traditional trading partners here in North America, but with important growing economies around the world. And Mr. Speaker, I truly hope that my friend and colleague from the Trade Committee urges his colleagues in the NDP to stop their decades-long opposition to trade and recognize the opportunities for Canadian employers under our Global Markets Action Plan, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's interesting that the statistics my friend raises, the highest percentage increase in trade comes with those countries that we don't have trade agreements with, China and Hong Kong. That speaks to some flaws in the current neoliberal trade template that I would urge my friend to take a look at. Now, Mr. Speaker, we have problems in this country on trade, and all the rhetoric in the world won't change that. We have record-breaking current account deficits 5 years in a row. We have record-breaking foreign debt. We have a hollowed-out economy. We have low productivity. And remember, all liabilities caused by these recurring current account deficits need to be paid back. Now, this raises an important question about process. American and European trade negotiators are releasing trade texts to legislators and the public. Why does this government insist on secrecy when our allies choose transparency? Do they have something to hide? With all this bad news about trade in Canada, Canadians need to know that the Conservatives are being watched on the trade file. Canadians deserve checks and balances in our trade negotiations to ensure they don't get another bad deal from this government. So Is the reason the government is afraid to be transparent with Canadians because its trade performance is so objectively poor?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I thank my colleague for that second question. And I'm optimistic, Mr. Speaker. It's late in the evening here in this place, but I'm optimistic because he did focus on our growing trade with Asia, and specifically he mentioned China. So I take that as my friend, Mr. Speaker, will talk to his colleagues about the importance of foreign investment protection and promotion agreements that secure legal certainty and rights for Canadian exporters in parts of the world where such rights don't yet exist. Exactly. So a FIPA with China would actually provide Canadian employers. These are people that employ people in his riding, Mr. Speaker, in my riding. That will give them some certainty. So I'm optimistic that perhaps the honourable member is turning the page with his caucus, and they will support the Foreign Investment Protection and Promotion Agreement with China when that comes due, Mr. Speaker. And secrecy, the UK, the European Commission ambassador to Canada, highlighted the exceptional amount of sector and regional overview we've provided with the European trade deal, Mr. Speaker, saying she uses our materials to talk about the agreement. And my colleague I hope to see tomorrow, Mr. Speaker, as we get an update from department officials on the Trans-Pacific Partnership discussions.